On what is not as chilly night as it was, but nevertheless, it's not pleasant out there. As a bit of an introduction, I mean, my day job is I run a venture fund that invests money in clean energy technologies, technologies that are designed to beat fossil fuels in the open market and mitigate climate risk. So that's what I do. I invest money, I build companies. It's a very pragmatic, a Bay Street type of role. We don't operate on Bay Street, we operate on the Mars buildings. The point I'm making is that this book, this talk is fashioned after a book I wrote. So why am I writing a book? I'm not an author professionally. But what happened was that I was building out technology companies that I believe are fully capable of dealing with greenhouse gas emissions. Perfectly capable of scaling up. I'll give you some examples of what I mean: energy storage, next generation solar, biofuels, next generation biofuels, and so on. The recalcitrance of the kind of the mainstream investment community and the lack of ambitious political market intervention was perplexing to me. We all know that there's kind of a denial industry out there, but that's not enough to explain it. The question is, why is that denial industry so effective? And why are even very, very smart people capable of not reacting to what I believe is a very serious existential threat to our social fabric over the next several decades, certainly over this century? I have a newborn, believe it or not, and he will live to see, I think, a very good probability of living to see social fabric unraveling as the world gets hotter. So the question is, why? Why are we not reacting to this threat? If we can understand why we're not reacting to it, perhaps we can solve the problem. So an overused metaphor, the frog in a pot of water, we've all heard it. To me, it is a metaphor. I don't want an empirical experiment being done to verify it. I've been asked if it's actually true or not. That's not the point. It's a literary mechanism. But we know, put a frog in a pot of water, heat it up slowly enough, and the poor frog won't hop out of the water, because there's something about that frog's physiology. There's something that predetermines the fate of that frog. Something in its genetics builds out some sort of phenotype that it is unable, due to some mechanics in its body, to get out of that pot. So in a similar way, I'm interested in asking, what are the same kinds of mechanistic, beneath the surface rules of engagement that prevent us from acting on this problem? In sort of our cognitive systems, our financial systems, our legal systems. Why is it that the denial industry is so effective? Why is it that this problem seems to be one prevailing systemic risk that we are incapable of responding to in an appropriate way? If we look beneath the surface and we can find out what rules of the game are locking us into place, the equivalent of that frog's physiology, then presumably, because unlike that frog, we have, and I use this term very codingly for philosophers in the room, we do have free will. We do make up the rules by which we engage with each other in our economics and in our energy systems and so on. So the point of using this metaphor, which while it may seem overstated, dead frogs and pots of boiling water and so on, I don't think it is. Folks like Mark Carney, no tree hugger, right? Sees climate change as the single greatest systemic threat to the financial system. Right? So there's now language from big central bankers talking about threats to financial systems that comes out of global warming. So I don't think it's an overstated metaphor, but it's a useful one. Because again, I'm after what's beneath the surface. What is it about our cognitive, legal systems and so on that are locking us into place? Because we can choose to change those rules of engagement and hop out of that pot. So it is with a view to solutions that I use this metaphor. I take it this room is cognizant of climate. I am not going to belabor the point. Other than to make this emphasis. We are very, very late to the game in resolving this problem. The idea that we'll stop at 1.5 degrees is absolute nonsense. We're almost at 1.5 degrees now. There is latent warming in the system. If we went to zero emissions tomorrow, we would still warm for 40 more years. So we're not stopping at 1.5. I doubt we'll stop at 2. What we're trying to do now is maybe stop at 3 or something like that. So we're late to the game. So while we do talk a good game, while we do talk about responding to climate, it's not like we ignore it now. The kinds of responses that we are actually putting in place are absolutely incommensurable with the problem itself, with the risk itself. Bailing out of the Titanic with a teaspoon is another apt metaphor, I think, for that. So I won't belabor the climate point. I think where we all get it here. With an American crowd, I would probably spend some more time talking about that. But I think I can assume we all understand this risk is real, this risk is present, and is accelerating. There's a lot of hopeful talk coming out of Paris. A very young and optimistic prime minister, spoke of 2 degrees. Very intelligent environment minister, Catherine McKenna, was talking about stopping at 1.5 degrees. That's simply not what Paris delivered. If you actually look at the promises made in Paris, and while we may be disappointed in the ambitions of the Trudeau government, who adopted the Harper government's goal of 30% reductions in emissions by 2030, that is a very difficult goal to reach, right? This is a fundamental rewiring of our economy. The easiest 30% to get, the next 30 is going to be even harder, but it's not a trivial promise. And if every country kept their promise, if every country did what they said they're going to do when they went to Paris, and everybody went there with some pretty big promises, we'll stop at maybe 3.5 degrees. So we are not responding in a way that is commensurate with the threat. We are starting. I believe we'll accelerate. My job is to bring technologies into the market that will allow us to accelerate, to gain economic advantage from accelerating in this direction. But the point is our response remains tepid at best, and words are quite hopeful. Deeds are lacking. We are headed towards 4 to 6 degrees of warming. This seems pretty clear to me. 4 to 6 degrees of warming, if you ask the Pentagon what that means, the military, the National Security, Planetary Security Conference in The Hague last year, and the language the military and security people use is they use threat multiplier, right? So the climate itself, the warming climate is not the threat. It is the ways in which it amplifies stresses that already exist in some parts of the world, which will feel it first. An example that was given 2016, every single refugee, everyone that hit the shores of Europe, and you recall the amount of social pressure that put on Europe, right? There was a resurgent right wing, resurgent neo-Nazi movement. There's a great deal of pressure on how many refugees Europe was able to accept and maintain social cohesion. It was tested, it did well, but you can see how there's ripple effects. Every one of those refugees came from a water-stressed country. Right? The reason that a lot of those places erupted was because people are flocking to cities. In Syria, it's the longest drought in human memory. And they are now flocking to cities where they are underfed, the farms are underperforming. That adds to stresses that already exist. The military community calls it a threat multiplier, and anything past 3 degrees, the Pentagon has said they are unsure as to their ability to keep their mandate of maintaining national security of the United States. So this is not something that's no more shinny in the winter. This is whether our civic institutions and our civic infrastructures can withstand the kinds of pressures that get multiplied when the climate warms up. You can imagine what's going to happen if we have a famine or a drought in China, Australia, and California at the same time. We've never experienced that before. Our food systems are not designed with that kind of resilience in mind. Thomas Homer Dixon talks a lot about the kinds of fragilities that are built into a global economy that runs on just-in-time production. We simply cannot respond to that kind of drought. And the kind of anger that people have when the price of bread goes from $1 to $10 brings that civil unrest to the streets. Anyway, so that's what we're talking about, right? We're not talking about a simple linear progression of risk. We are talking about shaking something in a way that hasn't been shaken before at a time when there are a lot of people around. So that's the problem we're trying to solve. That's why I think a dead frog in a pot of boiling water isn't an overstated metaphor. But again, my point is to get at the underlying problem, to get at why we're frozen in place, and thereby propose some solutions. I'll end on this. This is a quick picture. For those who believe that markets have intelligence, and most people on Bay Street think markets have information, stock prices are the collective wisdom of the crowds in determining a company's value, for example. That red circle represents the value of all the fossil fuels that sit on the balance sheets of publicly traded companies. And if you look at the value of those stocks are predicated entirely on the net present value of burning all of those reserves, right? So the market is saying, we will burn all the reserves that we have on balance sheets of our fossil fuel companies, and it represents that much CO2 in the big red picture. The amount that we can burn to stay at 2 degrees is in the smaller blue picture. It's about a quarter of it. So we can burn only a quarter of the reserves that we have on balance sheets of publicly traded fossil fuel companies. Pardon me? 1/6 of it. It's to be a quarter to a sixth. So it's in that range. But the market is telling us they will all be burned, right? The value of those stocks. This is what Mark Carney looks at this and says there's a bubble here, and he believes that if we were to solve this problem, which we all hope that we will, we all believe that we will, then those stocks are way overvalued, and as investors rush to the exits, it will bring financial instability, the likes of which 2008 was a mere appetizer in the main event. He's very worried about the financial ability of markets to withstand that shock. Now, of course, if we don't have that bubble popping, we will burn all those reserves, and we'll have another kind of shock. But it paints a picture that says one of two things. If you believe the market tells us something, the market is telling us loud and clear we're failing on this problem. The pot is getting hot, we're failing on this problem. That's what the market, so the Bay Street type who thinks market has intelligence, I'm telling the Bay Street types, this is what all your friends are saying, we're going to fail on this problem. So, or you can view this as a giant bubble that needs to pop and everyone needs to find a way to the exits and our stock market will collapse and people figure that out. Either way, it's not a pretty picture. But it is in the language of Bay Street. That's called the carbon bubble. But I'm interested in solutions, so let's talk about solutions. There are really 4 reasons why I think we are stuck. I look at 4 sort of systems of engagement and the rules of those systems that lock us into place, cognitive, cultural, economic, and financial. In less fancy terms, it is very difficult to believe that this problem is as bad as I said it is. And our brains are wired quite literally to ignore the evidence and to ignore that threat. I'll explain why. Even if we figure out how bad it is, we feel like our hands are tied. Everybody has a job to do. People have money to invest. We have cars to drive. We have an economy to run. So we feel like there's a machine in play that we can't just stop. So our hands are tied individually and collectively. And were we to try to stop that machine, market forces are so powerful that it's impossible to stop that machine, or it's too expensive. The last gasp of the skeptic is to say it'll cost too much even if you manage to stop that economic machine in its tracks in a way that's relevant to the climate risk. So it's hard to believe, feel like our hands are tied. Even if we tried to move them, market forces are too powerful. And if we combated those market forces, it will cost too much. Cognitive, legal, financial. So let's start with the basics, why so many people are, so when I say denying, when I say deny the problem, I am not necessarily referring to those who say climate change isn't real. Look, there are always people who have strange beliefs. That's life in the free world. There are all kinds of strange beliefs that we hold. There will always be people who simply don't buy into this scientific evidence. What's more pernicious, I think, is active denial. What's more pernicious, I think, is passive denial. Passive denial is where if someone were pushed or asked, they would say, yes, I think this is a threat. Yes, I think the scientists are right on this. Yes, I think NASA has more credibility than Fox News. Therefore, this problem is real. Yet we act as if it weren't the existential problem that it is. If we were acting in a way that acknowledged the existential nature of this problem, there would be alarms ringing and there would be people in the streets and there would be a lot more action. So why is it that we're capable of holding the belief that this is problem? We all do it. I'm not making a moral judgment. I'm making an empirical claim about how we all collectively act. Why is it that we're able to act out our daily lives as if this existential threat weren't as present and real and severe as it is? And I think that's the most important question, because until you can get around that question, you can't get to the rest of this stuff. Why our hands are tied, why market forces are not necessarily working against us in solving this problem, and that it won't cost too much. You have to start with understanding the problem is real and acting as if it were. We all know what a siren is, right? The siren is that, the sailors would hear this song of irresistible beauty and their ships would be drawn toward this song and they would crash their boats upon rocks and they would meet the cold and terrible deaths and the cold and foreboding oceans. Denial, passive denial or active denial, but being able to push this problem out of our consciousness is a siren song for our brains, for our minds. Unlike, the hominis economicus, right? The modern view, the pre-modern view, I would call it. I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. We, views, man, writ large, as rational, right? That we are meant to be Spock in the TV show, but we are not Spock. We are not rational. We are not logical. We are not a Turing machine. We are more like Captain Kirk. We are irascible. We are emotive, and we have all kinds of irrationalities that make us uniquely human. And it is acknowledging how we think, right? And taking into account how our brains are wired, how a neural network operates. That's the starting point, understanding why this belief is so difficult to take on, and in particular, why it is so difficult for the political right to take on. And I say that as an empirical fact. So let's start about how we think. I mean, this is my academic work. My PhD was in philosophy of mind and neuropsychology. Our brains are a neural network. In short, from the moment we are born to the moment we die, more at the beginning, less at the end, we are forming connections between sounds, sights, people, things, images, words, and so on. We are forming a vast unconscious network of associative elements that form what in everyday language is our common sense, our intuition. This is the hardest thing to teach to a computer. Modern artificial intelligence, which wants to be able to have situated awareness, uses neural networks as a model. So, a baby's born and his mother, lovely, tiger, roar, zoo, fun. As we're older, money, powerful, politics, complicated. There are a whole bunch of associations that we make throughout our lives by which we make sense of the world around us. It's what we bring to bear as common sense to disambiguate meaning in openly complex situations. It's what computers don't do well. It's what humans do really well. It's hard to teach a computer common sense. The common sense is how we understand each other. Right? Language is imperfect, but we understand what we mean. And humans do that automatically and intuitively. So Kahneman wrote a great book, Thinking Fast and Slow. I would recommend this. So what I'm going to say about how our brains work is not controversial in the slightest for a cognitive scientist. There is a conscious part of our brain, which is slow, conscious, and deliberative. And there is an unconscious part of our brain, which is automatic, fast, intuitive. And the unconscious part of our brain does most of the work. You put a number on it, but that's where all of the preconditioning happens before our conscious mind makes a decision about it. There's all kinds of action that happens beneath the surface to decide what's relevant, what's important, what's not important, what attracts our attention, what doesn't attract our attention. It's all automatic and fast. And that unconscious worldview filters the ways in which we form new beliefs. Right? We bring to bear a worldview. That worldview is the summation of our life experience. It is summed up by our own personal worldview, our culturally situated worldview, and it preconditions new beliefs. Unless we think this is too academic, we can talk about what those beliefs are. So in the Western world, we have been told since we were children, human ingenuity knows no bounds. The future is better than the past. Right? This is an absolutely foundational Western belief, for example. The first fairy tale I ever read. The future is better than the past. The economy can grow forever. Human ingenuity knows better. Nature is ours to control. Ever since Sir Francis Bacon talked about opposable thumbs and a rational mind, nature is ours to control. I'm not saying these beliefs are incorrect. Far from it. We hold these beliefs for a good reason. It does look like nature is ours to control. We farmed most of the world. I fly in a plane from Toronto to Vancouver. I sit in an air-conditioned building when I go to work. I watch TV. There are good reasons that we hold this view. The future has been better than the past since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The economy has been growing since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. These beliefs are not false. The problem we have is these beliefs, which I'm not saying they're explicit. Everyone runs around repeating these beliefs to themselves. They can be implicit, right? They are part of our common sense that we use to make sense of the world. These are stories that we've told ourselves since we were children, inside our culturally situated normative constraints. The problem with these beliefs is not that they're false, it's that they're incompatible, fully and totally, with the fact of climate change as an existential risk. The future is not better than the past under runaway climate change. It's far worse. Human ingenuity may not solve this problem. Doesn't seem to be solving it thus far. The economy can't grow forever. Nature is not ours to control. So the problem we have is the truth of climate risk bumps up against these beliefs. Now, lest we think this is sort of hand-waving, you can measure this stuff, right? You can measure cognitive biases. This was Kahneman's great contribution to cognitive science. Start with something like avoiding effort. So the first thing your unconscious brain will do when it encounters a question about climate change, whether it's real, whether it's not, is it bad, is it not bad, the first thing your unconscious brain will do is avoid effort. Right? And one of the most primal inputs into any thinking is emotion. We are embodied creatures with emotions. And your unconscious brain will do a bait and switch. It won't act the first time you encounter anybody. And again, I'm not making a moral judgment. I'm making an empirical claim about what it is to be a human being, myself included. Right? It's an empirical claim, not a normative claim. When we first encounter climate change, it's confusing and scary. And it happens to run counter to most of the ways in which we view ourselves and our role in the world. And so your brain will do a bait and switch. Instead of answering the question, do you believe in climate change, or whatever the relevant question would be, do you believe it's an existential threat or something like that, your brain will say, how does climate change make me feel? And it makes all of us feel deeply uncomfortable, right? And so the first thing, all of our default position when we come across this threat is to disbelieve it, to discount the threat, because that's what your unconscious brain does to avoid effort, as any physical system will do. The next thing we do, confirmation bias. There's probably some scientists in the room. Even in the hard sciences, it is very difficult to avoid confirmation bias. Confirmation bias being, I accept evidence for beliefs I already have, and I reject evidence for beliefs that counter beliefs I already have. So we start by not believing climate change is an existential threat because it's disturbing to us. And it runs counter to our common sense, our view of ourselves in the world. And then all the evidence we see around us confirms that. If you want to know climate change isn't a threat, turn on the TV. Go on the internet. There is an enormous amount of junk food for your brain that will confirm what you already want to believe, which is that climate change is not an existential threat. Right? Confirmation bias. There's a lot. That's why it's so effective when someone says, "Don't worry." I find myself in an article where they say, "Oh, there's a variable in climate. What's the warming from a doubling of CO2, and it's somewhere between 2.5 and 4 degrees." And I would read an article that veers to the lower side of that range. Maybe it's about 2, and I gobble that article up because it's confirming something I want to believe, which is it's not as bad as it is. But that's just not the case. The evidence is coming in. It's more like 3.5 degrees. Anyway, the point being, it's probably worse than we think. But even I find evidence for something that I want to believe because that's what humans do. Right? That's what Kirk does. It's not what Spock does. It's what Kirk does. We're Kirk. So we find confirmation bias. There's lots of clickbait for us to find confirmation bias. And the affect heuristic. If you don't like the conclusion of an argument, you discount the argument. Right? I'm a trained philosopher. I have a PhD in philosophy. It took me a long time to be able to avoid the affect heuristic, which is you tend not to believe arguments that have a conclusion you don't like. Right? So you start out not believing it. You find evidence that that's true. Someone tries to give you an argument, some pointy-headed scientist gives you data, and you simply don't like the conclusion, you don't believe the argument. And peer group bias means we value the opinions of our peers more than we value the opinions of experts. And by peers, that includes celebrities, by the way. So in measuring these biases, Neil Young is a peer of mine. So he doesn't know that, but he influences me more than experts because I recognize him. He's a celebrity that I recognize. He's part of my peer group. So you can see how we've sleptwalked into this problem collectively over the past 20 years. There's a reason that there's been such an effective anti-science campaign, which has been organized and funded, but it doesn't even do much, right? Our natural inclination as a group of people, all of us, is to sleepwalk through this problem until it just becomes too much to bear. And it's becoming that way now, right? I mean, things are getting bad out there. So what do we do? How do we wake our frog up? Well, none of this is news to a good marketer. Right? This is, the environmental movement, as far as I can see, has made the fundamental mistake of assuming that we're Spock and not Kirk. And the idea has been, if you simply get the right information out there, get the Margaret Wenties out of the way, get the Rex Murphys out of the way, and have someone with real knowledge of the situation write an article in the paper, go on TV, and we'll all endorse the problem, and therefore we'll recognize the problem and endorse the solution. And that's simply not the case. More information will not solve this problem, right? A better and more scientifically literate public debate on our television and newspapers will not solve this problem. Because even with the data in front of us, we are liable to all of this stuff, right? Marketers know this. This is how we get marketed to all the time. This is how people sell us stuff. So what is the solution? Well, I think the solution is you reframe the problem and you start from the solution and work backwards, right? So we talk about a future of clean energy abundance underwritten by an economic stimulus package that rewires their energy systems inside of a generation built on cool high-tech stuff. And that's what we're building at Mars, compressed air energy storage systems and next generation solar systems and cellulosic ethanol and yada, 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 yada. Lots of jobs, trades, engineers, lawyers, accountants, all get hired to rebuild our energy systems. At the end of that work, we are no longer beholden to a finite, resource-driven energy system. It is a technology-driven energy system, etc. So that's a kind of vision that speaks to our view of ourselves, our ingenuity, futures better than the past, economic prosperity, etc., etc. That vision agrees with our unconscious view of who we are in time and space. If you start with that solution and then work back to the problem and say, and so this is a non-negotiable economic stimulus package that we're gonna work on, and by the way, it happens to solve this climate problem that that scares us so much. Now we're much more likely to endorse the problem as being real because we have been painted a picture of ourselves as heroes, human beings, the kinds of creatures that we believe ourselves to be, our economy, the kind of economy that we want it to be, etc., etc. So we basically fool the guard dogs of our mind, these cognitive biases, by doing it by kind of working with, it's like Tai Chi, you work with the biases that you have. So, and we have these. We have the world's lowest cost solar panel company on the planet in Morgan Solar, right down the road. We have the world's lowest cost grid scale energy storage systems in the form of Hydrostore, bidding on $3 billion worth of projects up and down the US coasts. These are real opportunities, economic opportunities for Canada. And if we talk about those economic opportunities as being our contribution as an export-oriented clean tech economy where we mitigate risk away from the tar sands, that seems to be a bad long-term bet, into cool high-tech stuff that we export all around the world to help solve this problem, Canada's economic self-interest dovetails perfectly with our environmental responsibilities, which is to contribute to a global solution on greenhouse gases. Right? So it's a story that speaks to multiple groups, those who just want economic benefit, those who want to solve the climate problem, and so on. And if we start to paint that kind of a story that's Canada's role in this unfolding low carbon economy, it's something that a lot of Canadians can buy into, because and it happens to be true. Like, you can't tell fairy tales. You actually have to, and that's what our job is. We placed 60 million so far in 10 companies that are out there beating fossil fuels at their own game. We're raising a second fund of 150 million. We're going to do it again. We're partnering with Statoil out of Norway, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These possibilities are real. They're present. We have a federal government that is now targeting clean tech as a strategically important part of the economy. $1.4 billion to support export-driven scale-up of these companies. These are very, very good things to be doing, because they switch the conversation from one of mere environmental compliance and do-goodism into self-interested economic gain. And that's the kind of argument that gets past all the guard dogs at our brain. Saying we need to do this because we're scared and we're going to go hungry doesn't work. It doesn't work. If you speak to economic gain, you paint this kind of a picture, your frog wakes up, and we're better able to do this. So I've got lots of these kinds of stories. This is my day job. I mean, this one slide is kind of what I do. but I think it's important. It plays a role in a much larger picture, which is, getting through these our collective cognitive defenses that we all have, and myself included, to paint a picture that we're more able to endorse. So that's how we wake up our frog from the cognitive perspective. We talk about a future of clean energy abundance. Now, there are many who think that's not enough. I mean, Václav Smil, very smart guy, University of Manitoba, has a good argument. And he says, historically, if you look at switching from one energy type to another, even if the new energy type is better, faster, cheaper, which I argue clean tech is now better, faster, cheaper than fossil fuels. Electric cars are coming, solar's 3 cents a kilowatt hour, et cetera, et cetera. Václav says, look, if you look historically, it takes 50 to 75 years to transition from one energy type to another. That's the nature of infrastructure. That's the nature of energy systems. There's nothing you can do about it. So, this is a big, big, big rig we're trying to turn around. And I don't care how optimistic you are, what picture you paint about solar panels, you ain't turning this rig around in time. So he's very pessimistic about how many people make it through this century. He's a very dark individual. I think, in so much as his argument is historical, he is correct. But I don't think we're historically determined to fail. He believes we are historically determined to fail. I don't, because like that frog, we have choice. And the trick, though, is we have to change the context under which this transition occurs. So hold that thought in your minds for a moment. In order to not be historically determined to fail, it takes 75 years to do this, which every other energy transition has taken, even with better, faster, cheaper energy sources. It's taken 75 years. So we have to change the context under which this transition occurs. So hold that thought for a moment. An enlightened CEO of a coal company goes into work one day and she's like, I saw this talk the other night. We've got to leave our reserves in the ground. We have better, faster, cheaper energy sources. I, as the CEO of this fossil fuel company, am deciding that we are going to become an energy company. What would happen to that CEO? She'd be fired. She'd be fired on the spot. The board of directors has no choice but to fire that CEO. By law, they have to fire that CEO because they have a fiduciary obligation to their shareholders to maximize the value of the assets they're sitting on. It's the law. It's corporate law. It's good governance. So if they're sitting on $50 billion worth of coal in the ground, they will try to burn that coal. Any CEO says that we're not going to burn that coal, we'll be fired. The board of directors has no choice but to fire that CEO. When personal conscience bumps, so we've gotten through the cognitive part, right? The CEO's enlightened, they go into work. Their hands really are tied. They're tied by corporate law. When personal conscience bumps up against fiduciary obligation, which is the obligation you have to your shareholders, fiduciary obligation wins every time. There is no role for conscience against fiduciary duty in the boardroom. There's no role for it. You have a conversation, I guess, but it doesn't matter. So we need to change the context so that an enlightened CEO's conscience is aligned with their fiduciary obligation. Change the context under which that decision is made. Hold that thought in your minds for a moment. This one I'll just skip, it's not as interesting. But in any case, we have to change the context under which this energy transitions, change the context under which CEOs make their decisions as to how they're going to invest and what they're going to do, right? So change the context so that our hands, change the rules so that our hands are not tied. Well, how do we do that? It's pretty simple. We need to price carbon is how we change those rules. Pricing carbon for some people is sort of, it's the Antichrist, right? I mean, if you're a Chicago school economist acolyte, as many Americans are, as many of my Bay Street peers are, they believe that the freedom of the market, the freedom of the market to find equilibrium is sacrosanct. And if you're going to interfere in the market, it comes at great cost. It brings friction to the system. It's imperfect, et cetera, et cetera. There is a very large mountain to climb before you are allowed to intervene in the market, because the market is magic. It finds equilibrium, and equilibrium is a magic place where happiness is maximized, efficiency is maximized, Pareto optimization occurs, et cetera, et cetera. There's an enormous amount of very fancy lingo that talks about what happens at equilibrium. And it has been the basis of the sort of free market ideology for a very long time. The problem with that story is it's based on out-of-date math. Back in the 1850s or so, when chemistry and physics were discovering mathematics and becoming hard sciences that were capable of predicting the future, predicting the evolution and dynamics of physical systems, economics got jealous, and economics wanted to be a hard science too, so they invented their own economic models, at the center of which was hominis economicus, which is a person making decisions in their own self-interest, based on Adam Smith's invisible hand, and through the collective action of everybody making decisions in their own self-interest out of greed, greed acts as a kind of gravity in the system that pulls it towards equilibrium, and equilibrium is that magic place. And there's been criticisms of that theory over the years, and every time there's a criticism, there's a band-aid. Criticism, band-aid, criticism, band-aid. Including sort of imperfect information under which consumers make decisions, and yada, yada, yada. Well, gallons long, more than gallons, tankerfuls of ink have been spilled defending and contradicting the equilibrium model of the economy. The challenge is, back when they first built that notion, the mathematical models by which economics will become a hard science, it was 1850s math. And they didn't have the mathematical tools other than to assume there is a single point of equilibrium. Otherwise, you couldn't solve the math. You assumed there was one point of equilibrium, and you assumed it was the best of all possible worlds, et cetera, et cetera. You had to, because the math didn't work otherwise. It's a lot later now. We have much more complex mathematical tools, including dynamic systems theory, chaos theory, dynamic systems theory, evolutionary dynamics, call it what you will. It's just modern computers have allowed us to build state machines of complicated systems. And every complicated system we study, from waves to water to weather to social systems to neural networks to cells themselves, all are currently described and best understood through dynamic systems theory, right? Which simply says systems have a state, they have laws under which they evolve, and they evolve. And it captures complexity in a very, very beautiful way, because the complexity in a system can build, right? It feeds back. It's like the game of life is the very simplest version, right? You set up life in a computer and you can watch these little things spin across the screen. That's kind of the toy version of dynamic systems theory. And everything of any interest, any pattern of any interest is studied through that way. The reason is that patterns, stasis, equilibrium is a kind of depth, right? It's when nothing's happening in the test tube anymore, right? It's in equilibrium, nothing's happening. Nothing of interest operates at equilibrium. Everything of interest to us, every pattern that we look at, every dynamic, everything that catches our attention, weather systems, so on, operates far from equilibrium. That's the whole point. That's what gives them interesting behavior. The global economy is no different. The global economy is the most dynamic system that we've got, the most complex dynamic system we've got, because it includes all of our brains making decisions all the time about things. The point I'm making in all of that is if you simply take a modern view of the economy, equilibrium is kind of interesting. I mean, it's the price of coffee at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon finds equilibrium. The price of the stock at 4:30 has equilibrium. There are moments of equilibrium. It's not, you don't want to throw equilibrium out. But it's not the most useful concept to wield when we ask, how is it that we should solve this problem and use the market to solve this problem? Equilibrium is has nothing to say about solving this problem. Dynamic systems theory has a lot to say about solving this problem. The path dependency of the economy, what's happened before, doesn't just allow what can happen later, but can limit it. So you invent the internet, suddenly there can be Facebook. And once there's Facebook, there's a new economic law, the law of increasing returns, which is different from the law of decreasing returns. So the dynamism of the economy can be captured in this kind of language. It's a more useful language to sort of ask the question, well, how is it that we should intervene or use the market to solve this problem? It turns out pricing carbon is the punchline. But what's interesting about pricing carbon is that it uniquely can do the following. It acknowledges the open-ended creative potential of the market. Right? The market is an enormously creative, emergent property. Right? To deny that the market is creative, fundamentally unpredictable, productive, sort of ignores most of the world today. Almost incomprehensible. Certainly unpredictable. That's right. So, the price of carbon will do two things that seem contradictory. One is it can unleash the creative potential of that market to solve for this problem. You say, I'm giving you a variable to maximize, which is greenhouse gas reduction, so our variable therefore to minimize greenhouse gas emissions. How you do it, I don't know. Will it be solar? Will it be storage? Will it be carbon? I don't know. I can't. Who knows? Let the market figure it out. So you unlock all that creative potential to solve the problem. At the same time, you're constraining the market. So on one hand, you're unleashing its creative potential. On the other hand, you're constraining it. You can't burn that coal anymore if I just made it uneconomic. So it's not a political choice, not right or left, right? The left has to suck it up and acknowledge that the market is kind of the champion. It is the creative force that is unequal. At the same time, the right's got to suck it up and acknowledge the market needs to be constrained. If it's not constrained, it'll put us right over the cliff. So it's not left or right. It's simply the best tool that we have to solve this problem. And there's a number of arguments I make and others have made about the unique role that pricing carbon can play if you take seriously the notion that it is a dynamic, evolving economy. Right? It is more effective than a regulatory approach in many ways. Now, we're so late to the game that I don't think a price on carbon is sufficient anymore. It is necessary but not sufficient because we have maybe 10 or 20 years left, and we need a price on carbon around, I would guess, $300. The National Roundtable on the Economy and Environment did a lot of work on this, David McLaughlin, etc. Estimated we've got to get up around 160, 200 to come close to meeting sort of our Paris targets. That's not politically palatable. So we need other ways of accelerating this transition. But the sine qua non of policy to use and affect the market to solve this problem is a price on carbon. So that's how. So here's this. I like this picture because if you think about this river, there's no way you can tell where any water molecule is going to end up. It's like the market is too chaotic. There's too much action. It's too fundamentally creative. You can't really tell what eddies are going to occur. Because it's too interesting, it's too dynamic a system to predict such a detailed part of it. But you can predict that every water molecule in this river is going to end up at the bottom, right? Gravity is sucking that water down that hill. In the same way, a price on carbon will pull the economy into a low carbon state without predetermining how it's going to do it, right? Entrepreneurs and bankers and others, people, engineers will figure it out. But you're giving a signal that pulls that creative activity in a single direction in the same way gravity pulls water down this hill. So, yeah.
Which carbon pricing mechanism do you think is more effective? Cap and trade, carbon market, or carbon tax?
It depends. So they're formally equivalent in terms of their effectiveness from a mathematical perspective. It depends on what areas you're targeting. So I think for large emitters, I think cap and trade is pretty effective, mainly because you can't know both the price and the amount that you reduce, right? If you know one, you don't know the other. That's the nature of the marketplace. So in cap and trade, you at least know the amount of your emissions, and the price will be discovered. With a carbon tax, you know the price, and the amount of emissions will be discovered. A carbon tax permeates the entire economy. all at once, including consumer behavior. Cap and trade sort of targets big industries and pass those costs on. So it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. I think the bigger question around the price on carbon from a political perspective is how robust it is. So Ontario has a non-revenue neutral carbon price, i.e. all the money that's raised through the cap and trade auction is recycled by the government into other ways to accelerate this transformation. So it's kind of it's a 1-2 punch. So it's more effective for sure, but it's not politically robust. I.e., in the next election, it will have a target on its back because it is a cash grab by a power-hungry government. That's how it would be portrayed. Whereas in BC, it's revenue neutral. Every dollar they raise in carbon taxes reduces payroll taxes or something else. So when someone tries to put a target on that policy, they have to raise payroll taxes. So I think there are politically more and less robust ways to do it, and it's got to do with whether you recycle that revenue. But they each have it. What's going to be interesting with Ontario is cap and trade works best from an efficiency perspective, the bigger the market. So if I'm running a t-shirt, if I have a t-shirt factory in Ontario, and there's a t-shirt factory in Mexico, and they have higher emissions than me, it's cheaper for me to actually pay to reduce their emissions than reduce my own, because they have already installed all the state-of-the-art equipment and so on. They haven't. So in the global cap and trade market, you seek the lowest cost incremental reduction, but politically it's very difficult because you see money flowing from my t-shirt factory to a Mexican t-shirt factory, which is to make political hay out of that. The irony is that may be the only way for my t-shirt factory to remain open in Ontario under a increasing or decreasing cap on carbon emissions. So I think all of the interesting stuff will happen around how those capital flows are portrayed politically and so on. But from an economic perspective, what you want is one global market that's cap and trade, I think, because you know the emissions at least, and so you can actually relate the policy to the science, which you can't do on a pure carbon price, and you actually seek the lowest global incremental reduction. So it's very efficient, but it does mean you have capital flowing across borders that is politically unappetizing. Yeah. So we now have our enlightened CEO going into work with the price on carbon, so she can now, align her conscience with the fiduciary obligation and begin the transition from coal to solar and hydro and geothermal and all the rest of it. The last gasp of the skeptic is this will cost too much. Coal was cheap, the thing worked really well, and you greenies are going to cost us an arm and a leg, and look how much the Green Energy Act in Ontario cost, and oh my God, we're going to go broke. Well, a couple of things to say about that. First of all, I just think that's wrong. I'll get to that. But any policy is usually put in place for a purpose, and the purpose of reducing greenhouse gases is to avoid climate damage. And so the question is, well, what's the alternative? The alternative is not to do anything, and what will the cost of that be? So there are lots of very complicated models. The go-to model is the Dynamic Integrated Model on Climate and Economy out of Yale by a guy called Nordhaus. It's a giant spreadsheet. You plug in a temperature change, and it'll tell you what the damages will be. You plug in a policy of pricing carbon, it'll tell you what the cost will be, and so on. It's like, it's a cost-benefit analysis, which any good accountant will do for any good project. The problem I have with this approach is, first of all, it says quantitative. And I just don't think this problem can be captured in a quantitative way. Nick Stern tried to do it in a quantitative way, and he sort of said, look, if we're really being serious, the damages of 20% of GDP ad infinitum, which is essentially Mad Max. So I just think it's the wrong. So one of my favorite, and so briefly, I will talk about the flaws in these models. The first is that it dumbs the science down. It treats the Earth as if it was an oven. It's linear. So there is a very linear change in temperature as carbon dioxide goes in the atmosphere, and that's not the case. It's a nonlinear, complex dynamic system, and it's got dumbed down in order to fit in a spreadsheet. Now, Nordhaus is an honest academic. I have no bones to pick with Nordhaus. He admits the limits of his model. He says this only works up to about 1.5 degrees. Beyond that, I wouldn't really count on it. It has cascades of uncertainty. So not only is the temperature uncertain in terms of a certain degree of emissions, there's variability on it, right? But what are the economic damages? What's the damage from 3 degrees of warming? Well, you have to go from carbon dioxide to temperature, from temperature to effects on the ground to economic damages. And every step along the way, there is uncertainty that amplifies. As we know, as we multiply numbers, the uncertainty is multiplied, right? You always have to take the the significant digits, right? You take the most significant digit, you multiply them. So these cascades of uncertainty roll through the system to the extent that the output is essentially useless. And Nordhaus admits this. This isn't good past 1.5 degrees. Don't go up past maybe 15 years. So it's a very linear, contained, safe model that has written the monsters out of the story. There's no such thing as runaway climate change in these models. It doesn't exist. The nonlinear areas are built out. The damage function, what's the damage at 3 degrees? It has literally an equation in there based on no empirical evidence that just sort of arbitrarily sort of says, here's a line on damage. It'll be, I can't remember what it is, what the formula is, but there's a number you plug in that pops the damage. If you go to 10 degrees C, I think on this thing, I think we lose something like 1.2% of GDP, which is part of growth. So the economy still grows. So it has nonsensical outputs when you put in some of the more scary scenarios. Now, of course, you can always improve these things, and that's what people are doing. Gernot Wagner, very smart young man, is doing his best to sort of talk about these uncertainties, talk about these damage functions, fatten the tails, as they say. So there are ways to improve these models. The discount rate's is the ringer. I mean, it's like bringing an NBA star to a local basketball team. You know, the discount rate simply takes an event in the future, and just like an interest rate grows your money non-linearly going forward. So put $100 in the bank. What's it worth 100 years from now? An awful lot if you have a 2% interest rate. An awful lot more if you have an 8% interest rate, right? It's the classic exponential growth curve. Well, the same thing for costs in reverse. So if you take the collapse of the entire world's fisheries, all the oceans die, essentially, in the year 2100. There's no more fish, no more fish farms, there's no more shrimp, there's no more calamari, zero, nothing. And that occurs in the year 2100. Given a discount rate of about 6%, which is how people discount those costs in the future, we look at the perfect policy using this cost-benefit analysis. What's it worth spending to save the entire world's fish? About $16 billion spread out between now and 2100. It's nonsensical. So the discount rate alone predetermines that we shouldn't do anything about anything that's going to happen 50, 60 years from now. So we can improve the models, we can use a zero discount rate, we can acknowledge the uncertainty, we can have interdisciplinary input on how those uncertainties multiply, yada, 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 yada. I have a more fundamental problem with, and people are trying to do that now, so the LSE is talking about $2.5 to $24 trillion of wealth disappearing and so on. So the numbers are getting bigger. They're beginning to understand this is existential.
What is LN?
London School of Economics. So the people are making the models better, and some honest economists are trying to put numbers around it because that's how it puts people like. But I just think it's the wrong language. So I remember my favorite, and she's kind of famous, Nancy Cartwright at the London School of Economics, philosopher of science. She has a wonderful example. The sociologist in the room will love this example. She says, I'm standing on top of a building in downtown London. I'm holding a piece of paper over my head. It's about this big. It's a windy day. I'll let the piece of paper go. Tell me something useful about where that piece of paper goes. So all the people who are committed to quantified analysis, right, the spreadsheet quantitative view of the world will model that system. Just like we're trying to model the planet and the economy, right? It's a complex system. And you have three-dimensional maps of the city and wind shear and gravity and yada, yada, yada. And within seconds, the uncertainties cascade through that system. It's a chaotic system. And those who are committed to quantify it can say not much about that piece of paper. Now, sociologists might look at that piece of paper and say, well, that's a 20-pound note, so I bet it ends up in somebody's pocket. And inside that trite example, I think is a deep truth. And the deep truth is that sometimes folk psychology, everyday language, the way in which we speak to each other, capture truth conditions of complicated situations better than the science or the chemistry or the quants could ever do so, right? We don't speak to each other as neurological machines. We speak to each other as people, right? And that folk psychology is extremely effective in capturing what's important about complicated situations, right? The truth conditions are better captured in simple language than complicated language, because complicated language is committed to a particular view of the world that is reductionist and overwhelmed by uncertainties in any complex system. So how should we be talking about all that stuff about fisheries collapsing in 2100 and the cost of compliance and so on and so forth? Well, what's climate going to cost us? Maybe everything. Certainly a lot. Okay. What will it cost to mitigate? Trillions of dollars. So if I take the critics of act, trillions of dollars. Oh, it sounds like a lot. Let's spread that out over a period of time and over a large group of people. According to the skeptics of action, this is the Competitive Enterprise Institute, Bjorn Lomborg, who else? Fraser, all the right-wing groups who don't want to do anything, talk about the massive costs it will impose upon us to intervene in the market and solve this problem. So I have a separate argument to say we will be better off doing this, that there is massive economic gain to make this transition. Yes, there is an initial cost, but like any investment, you make the investment, you reap the rewards. We get off a finite-based resource energy system and move to a technology-based energy system whose output is free once the capital is invested. I would argue that there is a negative cost to action, and I have a pretty robust, detailed analysis about that. So does Mark Jacobson, so does a bunch of other people. Let's ignore that. Like any good philosopher, I will take my opponent's arguments at face value. So it will cost what the American Competitive Institute says it will cost to solve this problem. That amounts to about a coffee and a donut per day, coffee and a donut per week per person on this planet. But because most of the poor people can't pay for it, India's poorer than us, let's just say the rich people got to step up. It'll cost about a coffee and a donut a day. In a worst case scenario, now there's no benefit. No one makes the coffee, no one sells the coffee, no one drinks the coffee, no one eats the donut, right? Pure cost. Coffee and a donut a day, and we throw the coffee and donut in the ground, and no one gets a job making the coffee and donuts. So there's no economic benefit. Pure cost. Pure friction. Sand in the engine. Coffee and a donut per day per person to save the planet. What are we doing? Well, we're buying insurance, right? That's the language that I think Nancy Cartwright would endorse. We talk about this complicated system. We're buying insurance for the planet. Costs us coffee and a donut a day. In a worst case scenario. If we use that kind of language, I think people will endorse that kind of action. My grandmother lived through the Second World War in the south of England. This is our generation's torch to bear, coffee and a donut a day. This is the sacrifice we need to make to keep civilization going. I know my grandmother would say if she thought we would shy away from the burden of paying for a coffee and a donut per day, she would be aghast that this generation were so selfish, given what her generation did. So that kind of language, I think, is more effective. And it actually captures the true conditions of the problem and the solution and why we're doing it far better than an economic analysis based on spreadsheets and cost benefit. So I'm willing to engage on cost benefit. Again, I have arguments to say we're better off for making this transition. I don't need to. I'll just accept that there's a cost, but it's a cost that I think we would bear, given the language of insuring ourselves against some of the nightmare scenarios that we know are going to unfold this century. So that's what we do in terms of cost too much, is we change the language, talk about buying climate insurance, and it's a bargain. So we talk about a future of clean energy abundance to get through our cognitive dissonance on this problem. We change the rules so that once we all wake up to this problem, we can align our fiduciary obligation with our conscience as investors, as people with jobs, as CEOs, as investors, as parents. And we do that by pricing carbon. And we bear the cost of pricing carbon by acknowledging that we simply need to buy insurance to save our planet from potential catastrophe the same way we buy insurance for our house. And that's the burden that we're going to bear. And I would finish with this. We live in a time, there has never been more capital sloshing around global capital markets doing nothing. American corporations alone sit on $2 trillion of cash that they're doing nothing with, never mind $1 trillion or so that sits offshore in tax-free havens that they're looking to repatriate. We sit at a time when there is more engineering talent than ever before. We have more entrepreneurial talent than ever before. We have bigger engineering firms than ever before. We sit on an industrial machine, the likes of which we've never had, because the future has been getting better so far. And we have built an absolutely enormous and mind-numbingly capable economic machine of engineers and nanobiologists and venture capitalists. And we can solve this problem in a second if we decide. There was a time in Apollo 13, right? They're on their spaceship and the world watched while with duct tape, spit, and I don't know what else they used up there. Who knows what they had to put things together? They solved their problem, right? Apollo 13. This is our Apollo 13, right? There is no other ship. Like, I know Elon Musk wants to go to Mars, and I love Elon Musk, but we're not colonizing Mars. This is our Apollo 13 moment. And we sit at a time in history where we can solve this problem. We direct our engineering, industrial, and entrepreneurial and scientific talent towards solving this problem. And if we do, it doesn't cost us much. It costs us coffee and a donut a day, at the worst case, right? And that's the challenge that this generation is being asked to step up to. I don't think it's a lot to ask. If we don't do it, my newborn will have a really shitty life because I don't think social frappe is going to hold past 3 or 4 degrees. I really just don't think it will. We're beginning to see already south of the border what happens when people feel insecure, right? I was kind of hoping it would be a good despot, it could be a Sanders-Trump face-off. Where do we go when we feel scared? The nice guy or the mean guy? They went to the mean guy. That's where it could go, right? And this is the beginning. This is the amuse bouche. This isn't even the appetizer yet. This is the pre-dinner snack in terms of insecurity. So it is really important. I think the next phase of my work is to begin to understand what kinds of social fabric we need to build that will hold together so that my son lives in a world where they help each other rather than hurt each other. That it's not a zero-sum game, right? What are you going to do when, Pakistan irrigation systems run out of water, which they will. Pakistan's a nuclear state. As Gwynne Dyer has pointed out, no nation or tribe or political entity has starved before they go to war. It just doesn't happen. The population will not allow it. Pakistan is the largest irrigated piece of land in the world, and they're a nuclear state. And if you think they're not going to hold us hostage rather than go hungry, you're mistaken. So we need to think about those kinds of possibilities because they are coming. Right? We're not stopping climate change. So that's the next phase of this journey I'm on. But for now, I'm still focused on mitigation rather than adaptation. And this is how I think we begin to get on the mitigation path. And this is how we wake our collective frogs up and solve this problem. Because I'll end on the optimistic note, because you kind of have to. We can solve this problem. We can produce solar power for 3 cents a kilowatt hour now. Hydrostore, our energy storage company right out of Toronto, Ontario, can build energy storage systems that can take an entire nuke plant's output from, just for size. I know we don't like nuke in this room, but just for size, can take a nuke plant's power all night long and store it in the form of compressed air in an underground cavern the size of a football field. That'll take solar power all day long, release it all night long. We have energy storage systems that are economically viable and scalable. We have solar power that is really cheap. We can make cellulosic ethanol from agricultural waste cheaper than gasoline, Woodland Biofuels, based out of Sarnia, Ontario. These are all Canadian companies. We can solve this problem. We just have to decide to wake up. So thanks very much. That's my talk. I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on Project Drawdown Paul Hawkins brought together in the U.S.?
Can you describe a little more about Project? I know Paul Hawkins, but I don't know the Project Drawdown.
Sure. So what he's done is he's pulled together around 100 scientists, philosophers, thinkers. They ranked the most promising 100 projects, which include educating girls and shifting to plant-based diet, and so on and so forth. It seems really good.
Yeah.
And it certainly meshes with what you're talking about.
Yeah. So I don't know. I haven't read the book yet. I've heard about it. It's on my reading list, and I have a lot of respect for Paul. I think he's a very smart guy, and I think I've heard an interview with him on the book, so I can only I'm razor thin on the book. But I think what's Project Drawdown. But I think what's interesting about it is he's not predetermining that he's got to be in love with technology, because there's lots of techno optimism out of Silicon Valley. I speak like a venture guy. I'm like, I'm all talking about energy systems. Well, I like what his approach is. He just says, everything counts. Educating girl, let's look at what gets results. So I like that approach a lot, because a lot of it's just low-tech behavioral stuff, which can happen very quickly. You don't need a big bank to help you with behavioral change. You've reminded me to go and read Hawkins' book.
It's online, just drawdown.org.
Drawdown.org, thank you. Yeah. Good. Yeah.
So you paint a very complex and dire situation of climate change. And then you identify some of the psychological mechanisms that make it difficult for human beings to deal with this problem.
Right.
So you set the scene very well, but it seems to me you then provide a very simple solution. Let's price carbon. And they say, well, it's hard to price carbon, so how are we going to get that done? And then although before you had said that human beings really have limited are irrational in various respects. We then fall back on the notion of rationality as the solution. There's cost-benefit analyses that show that, the long-term costs of climate change are much more than the short-term costs of dealing with it. And these models are too abstract to make them more concrete. We can solve it. Now, I guess my response is, if only it were so simple, because what you leave out of the equation is so much of the whole picture. You don't deal with inequality, for example. You don't deal with the fact that certain groups and classes benefit from the existing situation. They are the ones that pay the highest cost of innovation. You don't deal with the politics of it, the fact that the groups that benefit from the existing system are actually powerful, way beyond their numbers. You don't deal with, for example, the global situation, the fact that the largest economy in the world, the United States, is now moving in the opposite direction from which you're going. Or that the second greatest economy, China, is not, no long-term plans are, except to decrease its impact, to try and hold its increase in carbon below a certain level. In other words, you don't deal, these are just three examples of things that you haven't dealt with. And if you don't deal with the politics, if you provide this notion that we're all in the same boat, that we're all just rational beings making a decision, you don't give us any idea of how it is that certain individual will fight so hard against what you're talking about, and how they are so powerful, and how it is hard to overcome the collective action problem of getting groups together to actually do anything about it.
Yeah.
So it seems to me, until you started talking about this other issue, the solution is really a non-solution.
Sure, well, I only had an hour, so I'll get into that if you like. So, Trump backing off on climate is morally reprehensible, but it opens an opportunity for Canada to step up and take market share from the Americans on Cleantech. So it becomes an economic argument for Canada. The dynamic with China involves their manufacturing capacity. So the one thing that they do very well is scale manufacturing. So I think the solution from a political perspective is to instigate trade agreements where our intellectual property is respected, so we become the innovators of the next generation solar panel, and we license in, feed in that technology to the Chinese manufacturing juggernaut to keep prices low. On the issue of elites benefiting, yes, it's a huge problem. So Tom Steyer, a billionaire philanthropist who used to be a hedge fund guy, is now a climate hawk in the States. He talks a lot about his billionaire friends. When he talks to them, he says, why aren't you worried about this problem too? And their response is usually to say, I live in a penthouse apartment in Manhattan, and my fridge is full of food, why is this my problem? And so again, the trick there is to make the risk personal for those groups. And I think there are those who make those arguments on Bay Street and Wall Street where the asset classes they've invested in are the rest, and you have to make that risk personal to them. So I agree that what I didn't cover. I only had an hour. There's more of it in the book. But you're absolutely right. It's a highly complex problem space. I've sketched out a very public-friendly, easy-to-digest version of it. But there's more to it, and I can talk for days. But you are absolutely right to point out there's big missing chunks in there. But I can't cover it. I can't cover it all. But you are right in pointing out those links, all of them. Yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
Thanks. Having attended many of these lectures, I must say, I really enjoy your lecture as an emotionally charged presentation. It is nice to see. However, I have a great deal of respect for your mother and her age. Second World War kind of thing, when Britain had what you call they said how much you can have things.
They rationed. Yeah.
The rationing part of it, I think, has to arrive a little early now. It's an option that's not being discussed in all the hoopla about modeling and presentation. This theory, that theory. There is a simple solution. It should be on the right. And to me, what that would mean is that the high consumptive lifestyles of the OECD countries have to be rationed first.
How are you going to do that?
Well, that's,
Right, I mean-
I'm saying what needs to be done.
You're right.
How we are going to do that, we all have to figure out.
Right.
I can't give the answer unless you make me dictator of the OECD countries.
Right. Right. Well, therein lies the problem.
Exactly. But the thing is that how do you talk about all these things, which is very interesting and very informative because it looks outside the modeling that normally scientists present. And it looks at the uncertainties and really deals with that. But how do you actually get all these things circled around and get to the point of reducing the consumption, wasteful consumption of the OECD countries?
Could I just comment quickly on that? I think the answer was already, Tom had said, and it was pointed out, there are two systems of putting a price on carbon. One is called cap and trade. The cap is the ration. If you're talking about a ration of carbon emission.
Yeah. So that's right. So on the carbon side, a cap is a ration. If one is talking about economic, Naomi Klein, for example, argues we need to shrink the economy, right? So rations for real, we shrink the economy, and that consumption itself is the enemy. We have to consume less. Well, my question is, when we try to get anything done in a democracy, you have to convince people that don't agree with you to come along, right? That's how it works. So if we're going to argue, so on one hand, we're going to argue for let's limit greenhouse gas emissions and let's figure out a way to rebuild our energy systems and lower GHGs. We're having trouble getting that done, right? And that's not a big ask. Or we could say, and we want to shrink the economy, which means pension funds don't grow, we have to redistribute work. I mean, so politically, one is easier to get than the other, and we can't even get this one. So the idea of asking for voluntary economic stagnation seems to me a non-starter because you have a very, very, very small tent. So the point is not finding out, I have an ideal solution I'm going to implement. The problem is I have to find a solution that the rest of the people will come along with me on. And so the notions of rations and voluntary economic shrinking and so on, it's like, yeah, I get it on paper. But the challenge isn't whether we can figure out what a solution can look like. The challenge is getting a solution implemented in a messy democracy. And so to me, all the hard stuff is about how you get stuff done with people who may not necessarily care about climate. Right? And even if they care, they only care so much. So to sell a full economic Che Guevara revolution seems to me a lot harder than selling, let's rebuild our energy systems real quick, please. And we can't even get this done. So the odds of getting this done, it just sounds like a fairy tale to me. So I just think it's a distraction. Naomi Klein and the Sierra Club argued against a price on carbon in the state of Washington in the last election because they thought it wasn't fair enough. It didn't redistribute the money to the poor. It was the only price on carbon on the agenda in the entire country, and they argued against it because it wasn't perfect and didn't fit what they want, which is God bless it, a socialist agenda. But you can't boil the ocean at once. And so for me, it's about pragmatic solutions that you can actually implement in a time frame of 10 to 20 years. And we've been waiting for la revolution for a long time. So waiting for la revolution now just seems like an absolute distraction and waste of time. Let's use the forces we have, bend them to this project, and worry about that next century, is my view. Yeah.
You're talking about a system which is global. In all these modeling, all the models like Forrester and all these global dynamics systems, they're all global.
Yes.
And you're also talking about changing things in Canada.
Yes.
But this gentleman is correct. We're dealing with political systems in 200 countries.
Yes.
Which are all impacting on the global system, which are not part of the global models frameworks that you are looking at in terms of systems dynamics.
Yes.
If you really want to do systems dynamics, incorporate all the political systems in the world into your eco model.
I don't have an eco model. I comment on Yale's eco model. But you're right. I mean,
You're omitting politics.
no. I am talking.
You're dealing with Canadian democracy.
Oh, I live in Canada.
Yeah, but then you don't live, the world is not Canada.
I don't live in India.
Canada is not the world. Canada,
actually,
how much of the world is Canada?
2%. It's 1.8% of the world's economy.
Yeah, okay, and that's what, so are we gonna change the world?
Well, here's how we change the world, actually.
Start in Canada, sure.
No, I know. I made the point, actually, that our biggest contribution to greenhouse gas reductions globally is to build economically viable solutions and export them to other countries to better enable them to solve their problem. And that's where our own economic self-interest coincides with our desire to do environmental good. So I think there is a very direct way of addressing that problem. How does a single nation act first? Like, if the states are not going to put a price on carbon, why should we? Well, I have an argument to say there's a $2 trillion market opening up. It's already $850 billion, growing to $2 trillion by 2025. If Canada got only its pro rata share, 1.8% of that market, our cleantech industry would be bigger than our automotive sector. And you get your pro rata share just for showing up to the game. If you do a bit of training, you should get more than your pro rata share. So I actually think that the way to approach that problem is to say there are independent, self-interested economic gain reasons to act first and gain a lead in what will be a very, very large global market. That's what China is. China, for example, owns the solar market. They made a decision about 10 years ago that if you buy a solar panel, you're going to buy it from a Chinese company. And they own the solar sector. They're doing the same thing now for electric cars. They've been trying to get into the automotive sector for 15, 20 years. They can't do it. They can't budge the European and American automakers. But they've done it on electric cars. Because the American automakers were sleeping. They decided they were fat and rich, and they made a lot of money selling F-150s. China took a long view, and they now sell enormous numbers. There's 150 car manufacturers in China selling electric cars. Tesla's a blip. Tesla's a high-end car. China will own the electric automotive space because they've made that decision. So I think Canada needs to look very carefully at its long-term strategic economic objectives and understand the world is going to decarbon. And by acting first, we can give ourselves an advantage in that market. And so that's why I think I can talk as a Canadian about what we should be doing, and I can align our self-interest in acting because I see this change as inevitable, and those who act first can gain advantage. So that's what it meant when Trump backs off of Paris. It is morally reprehensible that he's endorsing such a stupid stance, morally reprehensible. But if the U.S. Department of Energy is going to back off on supporting their clean tech startups, Tesla, Solar City didn't come out of nowhere. They had help from the U.S. Department of Energy. At the same time, the Trudeau government has put $1.4 billion in budget 2017 to help Canadian companies scale and export. Perfect time for us to take market share from the Americans. This is not the time for us to back off carbon pricing or climate policy. It is the time for us to double down because we can get an advantage by doing so right now.
Okay, I agree with that. That's positive, but no, it's positive.
Yeah.
But the question is,
Yeah.
going back to Václav Smil, I actually had him on a panel discussion once, and Bill Gates really looks up to him. Even though you start with this, there are tremendous infrastructures in place politically, economically, that are not going to change overnight, even though you start with these small changes that will multiply slowly and bring countries on board because of incentives, which is what you're arguing. But still, we're dealing with huge transformative obstacles.
Yes, there is a mountain. I start by taking that step.
Yeah, but we're talking
I don't deny the scale of the problem. I agree with you 100%. But I can't boil the ocean in a moment. What I can do is add some heat to it. Yeah,
it's a good start.
It's a good start.
It's humane and it's economical.
Right.
So.
But I agree that there are deep structural. I'm a pessimist on this stuff. I think my kid is going to live in a pretty harsh world because I don't think we're solving this problem at 3 degrees. But we're going to try. I'm going to go down swinging. It's we're down 4-1 in the third period. You don't get off the ice. Boston Bruins taught us that about 3 years ago.
But we have the whole world. If you're in charge of the UN and you have the chance to implement it, and the whole world is democratic.
Yeah.
I mean, we're dealing with better systems that if Canada, with the whole world, we're like Canada, and you were in charge of advising the whole world.
Yeah.
This would, then we would be closer to the solution.
Absolutely.
We're dealing with countries that are like, you know what kind of countries.
Sure. But, the Canada I know, though, doesn't shy away from acting on these problems, right? We didn't shy away from helping out Britain. We didn't shy away. I mean, the Canada I know has an understanding of the importance of taking a moral position on the great questions of our time. Now, I'm willing in the short term to link it to short-term economic advantage, because I got to bring the recalcitrant rival. I mean, we got to build a big tent. But my own view, we should go it alone because it's the right thing to do. That's it. Yeah.
Well, under Harker, we weren't so.
No. Yeah, at the back. Yeah.
Yes. Are you close or anywhere near to being able to persuade the Ontario government to adapt clean technology for about $550 million in permission of the potential nuclear plant? That money could, I'm sure you can think of better ways to spend that money.
Yeah, it seems they've made that decision. There's an enormous amount of money being raised through cap and trade in Ontario that is being recycled into lots of clean tech and factory refurbishment. So there is a lot of effort on the Ontario government's part. I mean, the nuclear decision's made. I think it's expensive power, if nothing else. So I'm not sure it's the best idea. I'm not the one making that call, though. It seems to be Premier Wynn's call. I think the reason, honestly, that nuclear keeps getting refurbished in this province is that there's just a lot of people who are comforted by the idea of very, very big baseload supplies of power. I think there are people who run big industrial plants who are just scared of the idea that a smart grid, built primarily on wind and solar and geothermal, they just think that risk is too much. And they as big industrialists say, I'm in Ontario, I'm Stelco, I'm Vale, I'm Resolute, I'm whatever. And I think they just have comfort because of the way they think as big industrialists, big single points of energy. And it makes them feel comfort that it'll just be there. Right or wrong, I just think that's how they feel. And I think that feeling percolates up to the Premier's office. And like every other, politician behind her, she's buckled into that. I think there's lots of, renewable power in Quebec. You build HV transmission lines to Quebec and get hydro. I think there are options that weren't looked at, to be honest. But I'm not in that room, so I don't know.
I have to say that we have a question from our remote viewers. Someone says there's a great challenge at stake. How to individually contribute and where? Any foundation?
Well, so it depends. A friend of mine, a colleague of mine, Greg Kiesling, has a group called Canadians for Clean Prosperity. Their mandate is to convince the political right that a revenue-neutral carbon tax is a very, very good idea. I think that's a good group if you want to affect the political dynamic. As individuals, in terms of behavior, I always trot out the super unsexy stuff, like don't eat red meat, insulate your attic. There's a lot of really low-hanging fruit before we get to the high-tech stuff like energy storage and solar and wind and smart grid and stuff. There's high-carbon stuff we do. The biggest one is red meat. Don't eat it. I like it too, but it's not a good thing to do. If you want climate action, you start with stuff like that.
Ride a bike.
Ride a bike. I rode my bike here today. That's right. Yeah.
In terms of your solutions, you talked about the pricing of carbon globally. So that's a mathematical formula that is offered currently in Ontario, I think. Which is described in BC. Sounds like a better approach. There is a Canadian-born energy blockchain looking to support climate change in search for the formula that you described. Basically, by putting this formula on the blockchain and having an economic incentive behind this, which we have, it's a way of supporting the four quadrants that you have there. And if you can provide any support in there or point us to a reference, really appreciate it.
So I haven't got my head around blockchain yet. I'm trying. There is a lot of excitement around the way blockchain will interact with the smart grid on the edges. I think there needs to be a link from the blockchain to a piece of hardware to make that work. So there's a distributed trusted computing company I'm working with that we're looking to amalgamate that work with a blockchain group out of Atlanta, so that you can have a kilowatt hour from a particular inverter, and you know it came from that inverter because you've got a trusted piece of hardware. But these are just words and arm waving to me right now. I haven't really got my head around it yet. So if you could help me with blockchain, please reach out to me. I would love to learn more. Okay.
I have another question from a remote viewer. Something about, is there a channel, a YouTube channel to subscribe to get educated in depth on the subject matter?
Well, I don't know if it's a YouTube channel, but on the climate side, there's an emerging star. She's Canadian. I think her name is Kehoe. Catherine Hayhoe, thank you. Yeah, and she's got some great YouTube videos.
Texas or.
Yeah, she's down at Tech. Yeah, that's right. Catherine McKenna tweets about her a lot. So it's. Can you repeat the name again? Catherine Hayhoe.
Catherine Hayhoe, and I think it's Hayhoe.
Hayhoe. So she's great.
She's an academic faculty.
That's right. Yeah. And she has a YouTube channel now. She has some great videos. So I go to her on the climate stuff for sure.
Recently is clean meat, like lab-grown meat.
And yeah.
What do you think about that? To me, it seems like one of the best solutions I've seen to make a massive impact on greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah. No, what's the one that has the really high-end burger? Incredible Foods, or what's it called?
Yeah,
Impossible Foods. Yeah, they make meat at the amino level and up. They recreate, including the grease and everything else, and they make it all from plant matter. They have 200 odd biochemists and people. Like it's an incredible feat.
Well, the one I'm talking about actually uses cells from cows.
Okay, they grow. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So there's a lot of excitement around that right now. And as a food tech and a way of sort of reducing the carbon intensity of diets without people really changing what they eat, right? Because there's it's easy to just say don't eat meat, but people like eating meat, and people who can't afford it yet and can afford it want to eat it. So imploring people to change their behavior for a noble purpose, I think, is really effective for about 10% of the population. The rest of it ain't going to happen. So I think that's why I think it's interesting. It's one of those kinds of technologies that says, you know what, you're not going to come to me, I'm going to come to you. And I think its potential to lower the resource intensity of diets is enormous. The question is going to be cost, right? Because the American way of life, they have a 79-cent burger, and they better have an access 79-cent burger. What's interesting is that Impossible Foods has gone after the gourmet burger, right? They're saying I can make a burger it costs like 15 or 20 bucks or something, but it's going to taste like a gourmet, like a big, thick, beautiful, greasy gourmet burger. If they can do that taste-wise, it's pretty simple to replace the sawdust crap you put in the other stuff, right? So it's interesting that they're going to work that. All they got to do is scale it up. So I think it's realistic. The other thing is insects. Someone said crickets, right? I actually think, particularly the first application is going to be fish farms. We're going to feed fish farms insects rather than sardines. Yeah, and so it's coming for sure. I think I don't know a lot about it yet. We're targeting food tech in our second fund, and my partner Murray McCaig at ArcTern is super excited about this stuff. So he would have a lot more to say than I, but I know he's pretty excited about it.
How does the donut metaphor, the donut coffee metaphor work?
You look at the cost of compliance so if you look at critics of action on climate, say it costs about $1 trillion a year to solve this problem. You divide the $1 trillion by the number of people, and it comes out to a coffee to donut.
I have another question. This is from Margaret Eichler, who's the Secretary of Science for Peace. She says, going back to the very beginning of your talk, you mentioned 4 false beliefs and then went on to deal with them. But there are other ingrained beliefs, e.g. that I am too powerless, ignorant, unimportant, etc., to do something about it. How can we overcome this part of the unconscious worldview?
That's a very good question. I don't know that I have a good answer for that. People. I always find it funny because people feel really powerless, and then you talk to a politician, you say, how many emails or phone calls do you get about a particular issue? And they'll say 50, and that's at a constituency of 500,000 people or 300,000 people or something. Very few people actually exercise the rights they have, and so the feeling of powerlessness to me is kind of a self-created illusion, right? That the irony is so few people act because they feel powerless, that those few who do act have an enormous effect. If you ask a politician or someone, what's a phone call worth to you? Like, what does it count in terms of measuring the metrics of what your constituents think? And it counts for a lot, because they assume only so many people out of the large number will ever make that effort. So I think there is kind of a pervasive mythology with that. But the other side of it is this: look, we don't have to act. I mean, even ArcTern. So I'm a big venture capital, building companies, blah 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 blah. It's a drop in the ocean, So we don't have to do things because we think the result is the straw that breaks the camel's back, to use a horrible metaphor. We do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And it doesn't have to be because it makes us powerful, or it's because it gets the result. Why do we vote? No, I mean, except for that one crazy election down south recently, no single vote ever makes a difference, but we vote. Why do we do it? Because it's the right thing to do. So in the same way, any action we take is the right action to take, and we do it for ourselves. We do it for our peace of mind. We do it for our sense of self. We do it for our soul. We do it for our God. We do it for whatever reason we have, but we simply do it because it's the right way. It's a Kantian thing, right? The golden rule. So I don't think you need to feel powerful to act. I just think you need to feel self-empowered, and you act. And you do it for that reason. You don't need to do it because it's the act that changes the world, right? Anyway, so that's kind of my, but I don't have a better answer than that. Yeah.
We're talking about the first mover inertia.
Yeah.
And it's about the perceived risk of moving first. Some people think there's outsized risk of being the first one in.
Yeah.
And you're saying, no, there's an opportunity, get in early.
Yeah.
And take that advantage.
Yeah.
So theory and practice.
Yeah.
Out of a thought experiment into the real world.
Yeah.
The gentleman spoke earlier, he's left now, but he talked about some of the realities of thinking that people are going to act logically, let's say, right, and it might not happen. What I've heard some people say is we're into a commons failure type thing, tragedy of commons, Garrett Hart. But the difference is that the cowherders are in two subsets. One subset has sticks, and the other group doesn't. So it makes the commons failure much more dire, because there are those who actually can enforce their interest.
Right.
So let's say you move first.
Right.
But who's to say that the trade agreements will hold up?
Right.
And that someone won't pull the rug out from under you?
Right.
Case in point, George W. Bush went into office saying he was going to do something about emissions and climate change. 3 months later, he wasn't talking about reducing emissions. He was talking about reducing the carbon intensity of emissions. Right. Which is a very different thing. He's shifting from effectiveness to an efficiency argument. Right. And the rules change. Right. So thoughts on that? Yeah. First mover inertia, yeah, and how do you deal with a system where the rules may change in progress? Right. So from a business perspective, there is always risk. So first mover risk is one of many. I mean, so it's about risk reward. So of course, there's no guarantees in this world that anything will happen. I mean, other than the laws of physics will say the same, or something like that. So any business doing anything, whether you make movies or you bottle water or you try to build solar panels, you have political risk. The regulatory environment may change. You have regulatory risk. You have competitive risk. You have all kinds of stuff. So dealing with risks is precisely what a good business will do. Now, in terms of first mover on clean tech, there's two levels at which it operates, as a country or as a company. As a country, it's not, there's an enormous amount of low-hanging fruit that we can pick that can be done to reduce emissions that gives us our own, it just makes our economy more efficient. So I built a hotel down the street. I lowered the energy use of that building by 75%. I did it by leveraging 5% of the building's capital and retrofitting it with geothermal heating and cooling, LED lighting, some smart thermostats, drain water heat recapture, and some solar thermal and solar PV. And the payback on all of that stuff, and I use this as a real example, right? That I, as a building owner, was wealthier because I made those efficiency moves. We have the first 25, 30% of our reductions as a nation can be done through those kinds of things. My building was 75%. I would argue that is a model for pretty much every commercial building in the country. You can reduce energy use by about 75% by leveraging 5% of the building's capital, and you can get that capital cheap because you get it on a mortgage in your building.
You did that?
Yeah. And it's meant to be an example of how, and so if everybody did what I did, we'd reduce and buildings account for 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So we could reduce our greenhouse gas emissions as a country by 30% just retrofitting our building stock. And all of that economic activity is local trades, local electricians, local drillers from geothermal. Like, you can't outsource that to China, right? That's local economic activity that has a defined payback that gives me as a building owner more money to spend on advertising for people to stay in my hotel, more money for me to spend on beer. So there is nothing but pretty standard, secure economic benefit from building a more resilient and efficient economy from that perspective. So the first 20, that's why it was so frustrating at the time. I gave a TED talk on it. I was like, we could hit Kyoto just retrofitting our buildings and we'd all be richer, not poorer. And we didn't do it. It was really frustrating that it seemed an obvious policy right during the time of the economic stimulus, 2008. I'm like, well, there's an economic stimulus package. Issue a green bond, provide a bunch of capital for everybody to retrofit their buildings. It's not rocket science. We didn't do it. So I think there are ways in which we can approach greenhouse gas reductions that are pretty much risk-free from an economic perspective. The more aggressive approach is to say, which is what I'm doing on the venture side, is to say, there are technologies that we can support that will get exported and allow people to reduce their emissions, better heat pumps, solar panels, energy storage, and so on. That's a more aggressive stance to grow our economy. But the defensive stance of just simply making our economy more efficient, I mean, Germany has a steel industry and a car industry. They just have a much more energy efficient steel industry and a car industry because they've invested the capital to make those factories efficient. We just haven't done that here because energy is cheap. So I think there are pretty simple ways to take those first steps from a defensive crouch, where there isn't a lot of risk. And that's 10 years of work anyway, retrofitting our building stock. That's a lot of work. And it's pretty clearly economically beneficial. So I think there are ways to go about that first mover stuff where you don't have to gamble the way I'm gambling with venture stuff, where you're going for the gusto and, you can do it in a defensive way. And I think that where you've got your back covered. And I think that just retrofitting our buildings is how we can do that.
Got to overcome the safety of the herd, though.
Yeah.
That's
yes,
back to sociology.
Oh yeah.
It's safer in the herd.
It's way safer in the herd. Yeah, Lloyd.
You think?
Yeah.
You said two words there, energy is cheap, and that sort of ties into something I'm thinking about right now politically, is what sort of happened and is happening in Ontario regarding electricity prices and how the high prices affected the politics in terms of the price and the reaction of the government on that price. Yeah. What are your comments on what's happening right now?
Yeah, that's going to be a real albatross in the next election, and I think it might cost Liberals the election. I think the challenge is figuring out why they went up, right? So Ontario underinvested in its infrastructure for a long time. I mean, there's new refurbishments. That's expensive stuff, and that's something that's kind of a sacred cow that we're unwilling to kill. But there were all kinds of other underinvestments in transmission, for example. So a lot of that just got done, and it raised prices. And there's the Green Energy Act, which is responsible for about something like 10% of the increase. But people will blame the Green Energy Act for the whole thing. But our bills are enormously complicated. Our electrical bills. Nobody understands them. I've been tutored on them, and I vaguely understand it. So it's going to be a big political football in the next election, and I think it could cause a change in government actually.
We have a new question from Nathaniel Schooler in the UK. Where can we buy Tom Rand's book? Any Kindle format available?
Yes, of course, it's a Kindle format. Online. I think it's still sold at Amazon and what's the big Canadian one? Indigo? I think Indigo still has it. Mm-hmm. That's the place to get it.
All right, very good. And that's Kindle? You have it?
Yes, we do have an electronic version. Yes.
Okay, good. Yep. Well, I'm going to call a halt to this. I hate to, because it's getting toward 9 o'clock, and I think that's when we're supposed to end. But I need to call attention to a change in the schedule that you'll see on the in Peace Magazine, at the back of the current issue of Peace Magazine. After we went to press, there were a couple of adjustments, trades that were made in scheduling. So next week, our speaker is Dr. Prabhat Jha, and his title is how to avoid cancer, heart disease, pandemics, and to live forever. Premature mortality in the 21st century. Dr. Jha is a professor of global health at the Dalai Lama School at the University of Toronto. I want to thank you so much, Tom. It has been a stupendously wonderful evening, and I hope you'll all go home and look on Facebook and see if you can find us, because they save these things, and we will keep posting them. And a while ago, I got a notice from the fellow in Montreal, Stéphane Natal, that we had I think he said 75 or so additional people online besides you folks here. So thank you very much, you people who are present and those people who are in the UK even. Thank you.
Thank you very much.